Did Noah's Ark really happen as Genesis describes? Could floodwaters really have covered the entire globe? Was God so angry with humans that he destroyed almost every living creature on earth? If the flood did happen as Genesis describes, what does that reveal about our lives and purpose on earth? And could it happen again?
Okay, so he has 5 key questions, and hopefully we'll be able to answer them. So let's get started. So we're starting a new series 2 during the Genesis flood. Today is lesson 1, compelling evidence for a global flood. Next week, Genesis flood washing away millions of years. And then the following week, addressing Noah's Ark questions like how large was the ark? Could a large wooden ark be seaworthy? How many animals were on the ark? Were dinosaurs on the ark? And then we'll take a 2-week break and then come back on January 7th, dive into global flood legends. So today's lesson is compelling evidence for a global flood. And again, I'm using a lot of material from Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research. So today's outline, first, let's discuss the reason for the Genesis flood, and we'll let the Bible do most of the talking. And then for the Genesis flood, we'll talk about the initiation, peak, and the recession of the flood. And then bring up arguments. Was the flood global or local? And then the 4th point, what was the main mechanism for the Genesis flood? And there's 2 main Christian science theories. One's the hydroplate theory, and one is the catastrophic plate tectonics using the Terra model. So let's start with what the Bible teaches. If you go to Genesis chapter 6, it gives you the reason for a global flood. And we'll start with Genesis 6, verse 3. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of his thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And there's a picture from the mural Ark Encounter exhibit where it's showing senseless slaughter, abuse of creation. They tried to depict how the wickedness of man by these different murals. And then we move on to Genesis 6:6. And the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I've created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air, for I'm sorry that I have made them. And here's another picture from the Ark Encounter exhibit of what it may have looked like when the flood waters started coming on earth and drowning people who did not heed Noah's advice. But Noah, verse 8, found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth also was corrupt before God, Genesis 6:11. And there's a picture of devastation of war, boundless brutality, and the earth was filled with violence. Verse 12, Genesis 6, So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And there's a picture of excessive hedonism, living for pleasure. And the thinking was they had excessive idolatry, offering their children to an idol. And God said to Noah, The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And then Genesis 6:14, God tells Noah, Make thee an ark of gopher wood. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits. And I have a cubit up here I mentioned earlier, and it's about 20.4 inches, and it goes from your elbow to the top of your finger. And imagine that's just 1 cubit. So God said 300 cubits, which turns out to be 20.4 inches times 300 gives you 510 feet. And we'll get into that dimensions next week. Also, its width is 50 cubits, or 85 feet, and its height 30 cubits, or 51 feet. And behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. So that was the reason for the global flood, the wickedness of man. Point number 2, Genesis floods initiation, peak, and recession. So let's talk about the initiation of the global flood. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. I talked about this last week, where the original creation was very different than what we see today. Like here's a picture of the earth's crust and picture of the earth's crust. And Genesis 1:7, and God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And there was a layer, as I mentioned last week, thinking of water vapor or ice above the atmosphere. And then there was also a layer of water under the earth's crust, maybe about a half mile deep, say 40, 50 miles beneath. And that's where the waters from the great deep came from. So Genesis 7:16, so those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. I have a video clip from Answers in Genesis about the flood initiation, and they try to depict the fountains of the great deep breaking open all across the globe and what it may have looked like at that time. Tsunami wave coming in. For the people outside the ark, it would have been probably pretty scary to witness something like that. What was the main source of the water for the global flood? And this clip's from Unlocking the Mysteries of Genesis from Institute for Creation Research video.
We expect that water came from the usual place, the sky. It rained for 40 days, all day long, all night long, pounding, hurricane-like torrential rain. But the picture's different now. You see, in fact, most of the water didn't come from above. It came from someplace else.
The Bible says that the fountains of the great deep were broken up or cleaved apart at the very beginning of the flood. The great deep, the Hebrew is Tehom, refers to the deep ocean. Many of us believe that processes that unfolded on the ocean bottom during the flood were responsible for much of the water that flooded the continents. These processes primarily involved rapid seafloor spreading, replacing cold, old ocean floor with hot ocean floor that occupied more volume. And that increased volume of the ocean floor displaced water that had been in the deep ocean up onto the continents. It caused the world sea level to rise. So we believe that that was a major source, if not the major source of the water that flooded over the continents.
So the source was under the fountains of the deep, underneath the firmament. Now let's look at Matthew 24, where Jesus talks about the flood, verses 37 through 39. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. So Jesus Christ, the Creator, and those verses we just read, Jesus spoke of Noah entering the ark and the flood coming and taking them all away. He described this as a real, literal, historical event in which there was a real ark and a life-destroying global flood. So let's talk about now the global flood peak. Genesis 7, verse 17 through 20. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark and rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. And the waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, which is 25.5 feet above the mountains, and all the mountains were covered with water. And there's a picture from Answers in Genesis showing the ark floating above the highest mountains and everything covered with water. Verse 21 through 24, Genesis 7, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life. All that was on the dry land died. So here's a picture of what it may have looked like during the global flood peak. People and animals clinging to the peaks of the land, the highest peaks, until the flood surpassed even that. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So 150 days is nearly 5 months. And here's a picture of the ark and how it would have looked when the world was totally covered with water for 150 days. Here's a short clip describing the global flood from Institute for Creation Research.
Creation scientists attribute it to the various stages of the flood.
The flood was probably a lot bigger than we can imagine as humans. We tend to think the flood was just a local flood a lot of times. A lot of people think the flood really didn't do that much. It was tranquil, but the flood was probably more devastating than anything else on earth. It entirely destroyed the earth. It was God's judgment on the earth.
Many forms of life, both human and animals, perished as the entire planet was covered with water, even covering what were then the highest hills and mountains.
Geologically, we have plates moving during the flood rapidly, meters per second. We've got the continents kind of colliding with each other, making mountain ranges. All the stuff was going on in the 1 year of the flood. The flood wasn't just rain. It didn't just rain for 40 days. The flood went on for over a year before the animals got out of the ark. So all this upheaval and all this movement and all these mountains and the Himalayas, all this stuff formed in the flood. And we see evidence of that. We see flood sediments pushed way up into these mountains. Tremendous upheaval was going on in the earth. So there were probably dinosaurs that were alive pretty close for the first 100 to 120 days of the flood, maybe even longer. But by day 150, the Bible tells us everything was completely wiped out.
Everything that lived on land and breathed air died if it was not aboard the ark. Obviously, the second main thing that happened during the Genesis flood was that there were survivors, those who were aboard the ark, and of course, sea creatures that live in the ocean anyway. They didn't need to be on the ark. 8 humans survived, and representatives of all the creative kinds, whether that represents 16,000 animals or something less than that.
One thing that the secular world and the creation scientists agree on is there were floods of some sort in the geologic record. And one of the things that we agree on are these mega sequences where the water apparently during the flood came in big, huge packages of water and then probably receded a little bit.
Now, if you have a rock unit, say near the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and then you have another rock unit near the top, obviously the one near the bottom was formed first. And so we're not going to dispute that, but that's not the same thing as saying it was formed millions of years before this other rock unit. And there are actually clues, strong clues within the rocks themselves that these rock units were formed very rapidly and catastrophically, not slowly and gradually over millions of years as the evolutionists claim.
And we'll talk more about the layers next week. Now, with the dinosaurs being the tallest of the animals and being able to move to the highest land areas, they were one of the last animals that drowned, especially those on 4 feet. Here's a cartoon of a dinosaur thinking he's going to be a fossil and drowning in the global flood. But also, they found dinosaur fossil patterns. And this is a short video from Institute for Creation Research from the film Uncovering the Truth About Dinosaurs. It's interesting what this reveals.
We see a pattern with dinosaur fossils. Why do they occur in some areas but not in others? And especially with the dinosaur footprints. They're along this dinosaur trackway that goes from North Texas and it swoops up on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains all the way to Canada. The flood may help answer that. Because if the flood waters are moving in, they're wiping out the last creatures to survive. The last creatures to survive are probably the hardiest. The ones that can be hit with water, can wade in that water. At the highest elevations during the flood year, maybe these dinosaurs were wading in water, and then during the tides, for example, the water would recede a little bit, and then the dinosaurs would have a place to step foot. And they were tracking their way in the highest elevations. So during the flood, we would have had water sloshing back and forth, and we would have had the conditions that set up for preservation of trackways and preservation of trackways in just the highest areas.
But the earliest ones, the Triassic dinosaurs, are found on the fringes of what's called the Dinosaur Peninsula. Those dinosaurs are mostly all small. And then as the water went up higher, the next group of dinosaurs, the Jurassic system dinosaurs, were buried, and those include a lot of the sauropods. The sauropods, those big long necks, they were very big, but they couldn't really run, they couldn't trot away. And then later, as we go further to the north, as that peninsula is being flooded systematically kind of from south to north, we get up into Montana and Alberta and Canada, we see the huge herds of dinosaurs.
A lot of times, dinosaur fossils occur in what we call bone beds. And so these bone beds are packed with dinosaur fossils. And some of them are vast. There's one that was discovered recently in Alberta with just hundreds of Centrosaurus dinosaurs in a 1-by-1 square mile area. How did they get there? Floodwaters from a massive, catastrophic flooding event could bring in the mud that would bury this herd of Centrosaurs.
This is generally described as a river deposit. If it were truly a river deposit, you wouldn't be able to trace these beds for long distances. but we've been able to trace some of these beds over quite an extensive area. So this is an indication that these sediments are being deposited under deeper water. And that's a major change in our view of how the lands got deposited.
So the vast scale of carnage that we see in the rock layers indicates to us that there was a vast scale of power involved in their death.
And let's go one step further. I thought this was pretty amazing. They actually uncovered dinosaur footprints at a lower level in the strata, and the dinosaurs actually died higher up. So it's almost like they were tiptoeing as they were encountering the up and down of the water with the tsunami waves and the strata coming in. And he'll get into this. Also, sea creatures found on tops of mountains as well.
In addition, we see sea creatures buried with dinosaurs. We see clams. We see shark teeth. We see fish fossils, garfish scales. Well, what would we expect to see in the fossils if there was some kind of catastrophe that mixed sea with land, that brought ocean water up onto land or something like that? We might expect to see some ocean creatures, some estuary creatures, mixed with swamp creatures, lowland areas. And that's exactly what we find in these dinosaur rock layers.
If you've ever been in the ocean, you know how you rise and fall with the waves. 1 second, your feet touch the bottom, and then a wave pulls you up. As you wade further out, you walk on your tiptoes until it becomes too deep, and then you have no choice but to swim. That's exactly what some dinosaur tracks show.
In many cases, the water levels were lapping up onto there, leaving fresh sediment, but not enough to wipe out the dinosaurs or kill the dinosaurs or bury the dinosaurs, just enough so they could leave a lot of footprints.
And so they're in shallow water, then the water gets deeper and deeper, and as the water rises, they're making claw marks, and then as the water lowers, they make deeper impressions, footprints. That's weird. How do you get that much water up on land, and then how do you get the water to flow and to rise and lower, and then how do you get these deposits to come in and lay down sand, lay down sediment, and in such a way that it's not too fast to tear up where they had just stepped, but it's fast enough to bring in sediment and deposit it right on their footprints to preserve them.
A couple other observations about the dinosaurs fit this global flood scenario. One is that when we first encounter the dinosaurs, let's say we're going through the layers of rock in the earth and looking for fossils. We don't find dinosaurs at the very oldest rocks. There's a certain point at which we find the first evidence of dinosaurs. Interestingly enough, when we find them, we find footprints. We don't find the bones, we don't find the bodies, we find footprints. Forensic pathology comes in. Why do we have footprints, not bodies? The flood makes a very nice explanation.
Then we go to Genesis chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, talks about the global flood recession, everything coming down. Verse 1, Then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. Verse 4 through 5. Then the ark rested in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. And there's a picture of the ark resting on the tops of the mountains. More global flood recession. Genesis 8:13 and 14. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the 1st month, and the 1st day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. So the flood lasted over 1 year from beginning to end, and then Noah could come out of the ark with his family and animals. Also, we read in Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9, about this as well. You have laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever. You covered it with the deep as a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the voice of your thunder they hastened away. They went up over the mountains, and they went down into the valleys to the place which you founded for them. You have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. So at the end of the flood, God caused the mountains to rise up and the valleys to go down, especially the ocean valleys. This allowed the water to recede off into the oceans. The earth is set up today to not let the ocean waters flood the earth again, because the sea valleys are so deep. In fact, they're deeper than the highest mountains we have today. Point number 3, global versus local flood. I want to go through some of these arguments. Many Christians today, and there's a lot of them, claim the Genesis flood was local. What's driving it is believing in evolution and millions of years, long ages. But if the flood was local, how could the waters rise 25.5 feet above the highest mountains? Here's a picture that can show this dramatically, because water seeks its own level. You know, if it was a local flood, and you believe the Bible, and it says 25.5 feet, well, water would not rise over local mountains and leave the rest of the land dry. That's argument number 1. Number 2, if the flood was local, why would Noah even build an ark? He could have walked to the other side of the mountain to escape. Point number 3, if the flood was local, how did it kill all the birds? Because Genesis 6:7 says, God said, I will destroy the birds of the air. You know, birds can easily fly away from a local flood and fly dry land elsewhere. The flood had to be so large to kill all the birds as well. Some more arguments. If the flood was local, point number 4, people and animals living outside the local flood would not be affected, thus escaping God's judgment on sin. If the flood was local, Jesus was inaccurate. Jesus said that the flood killed every person not on the ark. We read Matthew 24:39, where he said, the flood came and took them all away. Also, Jesus likened the coming world judgment to the judgment of all men to the days of Noah. If the flood was local, only a partial judgment by fire is coming. The coming judgment by fire is likened to the former judgment by water in Noah's flood, 2 Peter chapter 3. Point number 7, if the flood was local, God would have repeatedly broken his promise to never send a flood. Local floods occur frequently. I work for the National Weather Service. We issue flood warnings almost every week. We issue over thousands every year. Whereas a global flood, killing life on land, will not be repeated. And here's a creation-wise cartoon making this point. Here's a father and son, and the father says, look at the beautiful rainbow. It's a promise from God that he'll never again flood the entire earth as he did in Noah's day. And the son says, my Christian college professor said that Noah's flood didn't cover the entire earth. And there's secular or non-believing college professors, convincing young people. And the father said, he told you it was just a localized flood? And the son says, that's what he said. So he believes that God promised to never again send a localized flood, and they're on top of their house with a local flood. So it's kind of a joke. Here's a video from Dr. Andrew Snelling where he dives into this even more deeper. Was the flood of Noah global or local in extent? And it goes about 5 minutes.
Was the flood of Noah global or local in extent?
The question of whether the flood was global or local in extent is ultimately a question about the authority of the Scriptures. After all, the scientists, the geologists in particular, declare that the Earth is millions and billions of years old, and there never was a global flood. Thus, many Christians say, well, it doesn't really matter. Let the scientists deal with the science. We'll just focus on the gospel. But we need to remember that if Genesis cannot be trusted, then how can we trust John 3:16? It's a question of all of Scripture or none of Scripture. Now, the geologists say that the Earth is millions of years old because they believe in slow and gradual processes over millions of years. Sure, they believe in local floods and local catastrophes, but never a global flood. Yet when we look at the language of the Scriptures, the intent of what we read there, with all the high hills under the whole of the heaven being covered with water, the waters rising for 150 days until the mountains were covered, certainly appears to be describing a global event. Now, the context of the flood account in Genesis 1-11 is on the question of universal origins, the origin of the universe, the earth and everything in it, the flood, and then on to the Tower of Babel and the origin of languages. The context is universal, whereas when we go to Genesis 12-50, the focus is on Abraham and his descendants, the children of Israel, the origin of the nation of Israel. Therefore, in the context of universal origins, the flood is described as a global event. There are 3 chapters devoted to the flood account, and yet only 2 to the creation account. Therefore, the flood with 3 chapters must be very important. And again, the context declares that it was global in extent. The Bible talks about all flesh corrupted its way. God said he was going to destroy the whole earth. Why would he want to do that, destroy all the animals as well as man, if it wasn't to be a global event? I mean, the terms that are used there, as some of the Hebrew scholars have said, the spirit of the language, the intent is to describe a global event. And after all, if the Holy Spirit wanted to choose the words to give us that impression, then the Holy Spirit could not have chosen better words to describe the extent of the flood. Now, there are theological problems too with this whole question. After all, if the flood was only local and the fossils are a result of millions of years, then that means all the dead things, the fossils, accumulated prior to man coming on the earth. That means, of course, that Adam and Eve would have been walking on a fossil graveyard. Yet the Scriptures declare that God made a good earth. It wasn't until the curse that we find that death and suffering came into the world. Now, this is starkly illustrated by the occurrence of fossilized thorns in sedimentary rocks in Canada that are supposed to be 400 million years old. This is a complete denial of the Scriptures if that was 400 million years old, because that means there was fossilized thorns for 400 million years before the Bible tells us that as a result of the curse, thorns and thistles came into existence. We need to remind ourselves that Jesus testified to the historic reality of the flood event. In the context of talking about the future judgment, which will be universal, he declared that in the days of Noah, they were eating, drinking and marrying, and the flood came and took them all away. He was talking about a universal, a global flood. Similarly, in 2 Peter chapter 3, the Apostle Peter talks about the last day scoffers who will deliberately reject the evidence for creation, the flood, and scoff at the second coming. The second coming will be universal. The creation was universal, was global. Therefore, in context, the flood was global. Now, after all, there are also scientific problems. Why would Noah have to build an ark the size that it was, 450 feet long, if all the animals had to do was to fly and migrate to another location? It doesn't make sense. Why tell Noah to preserve those animals on such a large boat if all they had to do was migrate away? So there are many problems with denying that the Scriptures are teaching it was a global event. So you see, this is ultimately a question about the authority of the Scriptures. The Scriptures declare the flood was global. Therefore, we believe that the flood was global, and therefore the scientists who weren't there, who don't know everything, must be wrong about their declaration that there never was a global flood. God's word is true, and what we see in God's world agrees with what we read in God's word.
Okay, hopefully that was convincing enough. Now, the last piece, which will take about 25 minutes, the mechanism for the Genesis flood. This gets very interesting. And We read all the fountains of the great deep burst open and the floodgates of the heavens were open. There's two theories. One's the hydroplate theory, and I have a book up here called In the Beginning from Dr. Ph.D. Walt Brown. It's very thick, and we'll talk about his theory. And then the second one is the catastrophic global plate tectonics. They're similar but a little bit different. First, we'll start with Dr. Walter Brown's hydroplate theory, and this is a video where he explains his theory, and he can explain it better than I can. So it goes about 4.5 or so minutes. I think you'll find this interesting, so I'll play it.
Having served as director of one of the United States Defense Department's major research and development laboratories, Dr. Walter Brown comes with an impressive list of credentials and credibility. In tackling the subject of Earth's geological development, Dr. Brown has developed a theory that contradicts the generally accepted viewpoint of the scientific community. Profound and far-reaching, this respected scientist's hydroplate theory not only offers a completely new approach to the geological sciences, it succeeds where the prevailing theory often fails. It simply and logically explains some of the Earth's most profound mysteries.
We can see on our planet 25 major features that can now be systematically explained as a consequence of a global flood that erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 30 trillion hydrogen bombs.
30 trillion.
This theory shows us just how rapidly major mountains form. It explains the coal, oil, and methane deposits, the rapid continental drift, and why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. This theory also explains the ice ages, and it gives the primary reason for global warming. It explains the formation of the layered strata in almost all fossils, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. Surprisingly, it explains the origin of comets, of asteroids, and of meteorites.
According to Dr. Brown's theory, the ancient world that Noah lived in was very different from the Earth we occupy today.
Noah and other pre-flood people probably lived on one very large supercontinent with lush vegetation, inland seas, and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high. Before the flood, about half the Earth's water was in interconnected chambers about 10 miles below the Earth's surface. This formed a thin spherical shell, almost a mile thick. The pressure in the subterranean chamber had been increasing for centuries because the gravity of the sun and moon produced tides in the subterranean water that lifted and lowered the Earth's massive crust twice a day. This tidal pumping added gigantic amounts of energy to the subterranean water. This increasing pressure in the subterranean water steadily stretched the crust as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began as a microscopic crack that grew in both directions at almost 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched claw. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. The Bible even gives us a precise date. The 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. Then it says, and the rain fell. The fountains of water jetted supersonically into and above the atmosphere. The spray from these enormous fountains produced torrential rain such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The supersonic fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the widening crack. This produced huge volumes of sediments that settled through the floodwaters, trapping and burying plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Eventually, the crack became so wide that the newly exposed floor of the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of approximately 40 to 50 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, And like a runaway crashing train, they compressed, crushed, buckled, and thickened, rising out of the floodwaters. This is why the major mountains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. Today's major mountains were all pushed up in hours. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated.
This theory of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity appears to support the biblical story of the deluge in every detail.
He talked about the mid-Atlantic ridge. Here's a map of the Atlantic Ocean seafloor, and technology to find submarines enabled maps of the seafloor to be created in the 1950s. We didn't know that that was underneath the water. But what did they find? Notice the highly symmetrical mid-Atlantic ridge that's part of the chain of high topography, and that chain runs 40,000 miles around the entire globe, running like a baseball seam through all the world's ocean basins. Here is your evidence of a global flood. It's right there, and it separated the continents. There's a picture of the entire globe, and you can see the seam in the Atlantic and also another seam that comes from California and goes out to south of Australia, and another seam that comes up into the Indian Ocean. So what we're finding is the ocean floors are actually younger than most of the fossil-bearing rocks on the continents. And this is true even with secular scientists. They agree to that. The discovery precipitated a paradigm shift in the earth sciences in the 1960s. Thousands of miles of continental motion took place during the flood. New ocean floor created halfway through the flood. And none of the pre-flood ocean floor remains on the Earth's surface today. The Genesis flood was primarily a tectonic catastrophe involving large-scale motions of rock inside the Earth. Now, looking at the large-scale Earth structure, the continents have a layer of buoyant granite crust about 20 miles thick that oceanic regions do not have. You can think of these continental granite crust floating like an iceberg, where the new ocean floor at the mid-ocean ridge, they don't float like the continents. But also, where you have the mid-Atlantic ridge popping up, you need areas where the strata goes into the mantle, and that's off of South America. So ocean plates plunge into the earth and form ocean trenches. Here's a short video from Dr. John Baumgartner, where he talks about catastrophic plate tectonics.
Catastrophic plate tectonics basically relies on the fact that ocean plates can sink because they are cooler and therefore denser than the mantle rock below. This 2,000 thick layer of rock below the plates is known as the mantle. It's almost everywhere solid, not liquid like a lot of people have been led to think. It's solid rock. And below that is the core, which is molten for the most part, a small solid inner core we know from seismology. So you can basically divide the Earth into two main parts, a rocky upper part, about 2,000 miles thick, and then a mostly iron, mostly liquid core. The picture is that for this catastrophe, that the ocean plates sink rapidly on the order of meters per second into the mantle.
Okay, just think of the globe and taking a slice, like cutting it through the middle, and that's what that picture is. The center is a core, and then you have the mantle, which is 2,000 miles on top of the core around the globe. And I'm going to get into this a little bit here. So the global flood process, molten magma rises to fill the gaps in the mid-ocean ridges in the ocean floor as the pre-flood ocean plates slide rapidly like large conveyor belts into the Earth's interior. So you got the mid-ocean ridge popping up, spreading out, and then a conveyor belt going down into the Pacific Rim. Steam generated from the hot rocks at these ridges erupts as violent supersonic jets penetrate the overlaying oceans and train large amounts of ocean water. The entrained ocean water rises into the atmosphere, and then falls back to Earth as intense global rain. So that's where the 40 days and 40 nights of rain came from. Those jets going up in the atmosphere and then just causing thick clouds and intense global rain. As the ocean plates plunge into the Earth in the Pacific, into the continent margins, sediment from the pre-flood ocean bottom scraped away and accumulates at continent edges. As hot rock from the base of the mantle rises and spreads rapidly beneath the ocean plates, the volume of the ocean basins is greatly diminished and the global sea level rises dramatically. And the flow of rock in the mantle, driven by sinking seafloor slabs, moves continents apart by thousands of miles and opens up that Atlantic and Indian Ocean. So you can see North America and South America on the picture here is moving to the west. Africa and Europe is moving to the east, with that ridge coming up and causing those plates to slide. It wasn't continental drift. This happened continental sprint during the flood. And as gravitational potential energy driving the catastrophes exhausted, the runaway episode ends. The velocity and stresses diminish, extreme surface deformation relaxes, and the global sea level begins to fall. And then the water rushes from the continents, erodes and reworks much previously deposited soft sediment. And you see this out west. Here's a picture of Bryce Canyon, Zion Canyon, in the Grand Canyon. It looks like a stair step. And what was happening is the floodwaters were rushing off and creating that phenomenon. Also, you have zones of thickened low-density crust, mostly the result of subduction at the continent edges, bob up like a cork because of the buoyancy to generate present-day high mountain ranges. That's why you see most of your high mountain ranges along western South America and the western U.S. Now we'll get into his Terra grid. He did a computer modeling of the Earth's mantle to solve conservation equations like mass, energy, momentum. The question is, how can rock sink through 2,000 miles of the mantle in a few weeks' time? And that's done by mantle silicate minerals weaken dramatically by a factor of 1 billion or more when they're under extreme stress like the global flood. They've proved this through silicate experiments, which have been done in many laboratories around the world in the past 35 years. So with this Terra model, the mantle circulation, his model tracks what he calls runaway instability. So this top panel is temperature, and I want to just highlight, red means hot. So you got temperature, it's hot up here, up on the corners, and that's where the ridges are. And then blue is cold, that's where you have sinking motion in the mantle. Arrows denote velocity or speed. On the bottom is rock strength. Red and yellow mean strong, blue is weak. So we start, when it sinks, we get a lot of weakness down here in the rock. And the height of the box, 2,000 miles, is the mantle, and represents the Earth's mantle. And the velocity is sinking here in the center, like in the Pacific Ocean, at a rate of 10 to 15 miles per hour during the flood. So here's a short video where Dr. John Baumgartner showing the Terra model circulation pattern into the Earth's mantle. It goes about a minute and a half or so. He can probably explain it better than me.
This is the animation here, and I looped the animation several times to give you an idea. But this shows this is an actual numerical simulation of this runaway process using actual data from laboratory experiments for the deformation characteristics of the rock. So and this represents some very sophisticated numerical methods to be able to track this physical instability.
So Christian scientists have been able to model the circulation pattern into the mantle of the Earth, as he just showed. What happens on the surface of the Earth with the continents? Dr. Baumgartner used the pre-flood supercontinent concept in his model. This concept teaches that all the continents were together as one giant landmass before the flood, similar to Pangea. And you can see this on the left. This is actually from the creationist geographer Antonio Snyder back in 1858. So where he showed this is where all the continents were, and then after the flood they separated with the ridges. He was the first to show it. Dr. Baumgartner used this model and to simulate this. The Pangea mantle viscosity initialization, blue represents cooler material. So the model results. His model showed 25 days later the continents separating at 8 miles per hour and accelerating thereafter. So in the Earth's mantle, we have max velocities of material diving into the mantle and rising up into the mid-Atlantic ridge. So think of the globe cut in half. So you got rising and sinking motion on the opposite parts. So it's a whole circulation center in the entire globe of the Earth. And it's rising in the mid-Atlantic ridge at 14 miles per hour. So this should give Christians confidence and hope to trust the Bible and believe there was a worldwide flood described in Genesis. We have scientific modeling depicting and simulating the mechanism of the flood, and it matches the exact descriptions provided in the Bible as a historic record. Now that hopefully that'll encourage you to believe what Genesis teaches, especially on the global flood, but we're also in a spiritual battle. Here's an article, The Meaning of Evolution, from an American atheist magazine, and this was published in 1978, tells you what we're up against. G. Richard Bozarth writes, Christianity has fought and still fights and will fight science to the desperate end over evolution, because evolution destroys utterly, and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary. It gets a little blasphemous in a little bit. Destroy Adam and Eve in the original sin, and in the rubble you'll find the sorry remains of the Son of God. Take away the meaning of his death. If Jesus was not the Redeemer who died for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing. So if we do not hold to the biblical authority and the biblical account of creation, we will destroy the concept of original sin, and by introducing evolution and millions of years of death and suffering before man was created, that places death before sin in man. This ultimately leads to taking away the meaning of Christ's atonement and his work on the cross. And I want to leave you with 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. Verse 3 states, For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. And that's what we're trying to do, casting down these arguments of evolution millions of years. So before I close, any questions?
Which of the theories you think makes more sense?
The what?
Which one of those two theories about...
Probably the Terra model, because he got into actually modeling it. He published peer-reviewed article on it, and he presented his findings. But Walter Brown, some of them are matching, but Walter Brown's a little bit more dated than Baumgartner. But Christian Science really rely on this. And this is hardcore science, where he was able to model this using computer programming and showing that it actually could happen. Of course, this is all being suppressed in the science community. They don't want people finding out about this information.
We have a copy of his publication?
Yes. Now, any more questions or comments before I go into our quiz questions? Okay, so some lesson 6 or lesson 1 of series 2. Anyone answer, what was the reason for the Genesis flood? Anybody? Yep, man's sin. Yep. Why was the flood global and not local? Any quick answers on that question? Yep, good answer. Number 3, last one. Can you name a mechanism for the flood? You can even use what the Bible teaches. What did the Bible teach? What opened up? Yep. Yeah, those waters, the fountains of the deep. That's it. Well, thank you for your attention.